Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at a pretty bizarre political perspective, the distraction playbook. We're going to unpack exactly how, and more importantly why, unpopular leaders who are facing absolute domestic disasters actually go out of their way to deliberately pick a fight abroad.
Here's how we're breaking it down today. First, wars of political distraction. Second, our first case study, the football war. Third, case study 2, the Falklands. And finally, the price of conflict. Keep an eye out for our little stick figure soccer balls and penguins as we go through this.
Let's jump right into Section 1, Wars of Political Distraction as a Tried and Tested Tactic.
Think about it. When a leader's economy is in absolute ruins, or maybe their election is exposed as, well, totally fraudulent, political survival becomes literally their only goal. So instead of actually fixing the problem, what do? They point the finger. Throwing all that focus onto an external scapegoat can practically overnight unite a super frustrated, protesting population right back behind a struggling regime.
All right, moving on to Section 2, our first case study, the football war between Honduras and El Salvador.
Back in the 1960s, Central America was a total pressure cooker. You had El Salvador, packed with a massive population of landless farmers who started illegally crossing the border just looking for work. Then, right next door, you've got Honduras. Their economy was in shambles, basically manipulated by rich American banana companies. So you've got an insecure Honduran military leader facing huge protests over a corrupt election, and boom, he finds the perfect scapegoat. He just blames the Salvadoran immigrants for stealing all the land and jobs. Classic distraction.
Now, the 1970 World Cup qualifiers, that was the spark that lit the powder keg. It started in Honduras, where local fans taunted the Salvadoran team all night long. Honduras won the match, which actually sparked the tragic suicide of a Salvadoran fan. And disturbingly, the Salvadoran government turned her into a national hero. Then came the rematch in El Salvador. Locals there raised a dirty rag instead of the Honduran flag, won the game, and set off massive riots. The Honduran team literally had to flee in a bulletproof bus. By the time they played the final tiebreaker match in Mexico, which El Salvador won, by the way, the whole crisis was just completely unmanageable. They severed diplomatic ties entirely and actually declared war over it. The actual combat here was incredibly rapid. Hour 1, El Salvador launches air raids on Honduran airports. By hour 24, they've crossed the border, invading with light tanks and infantry. But then, by hour 48, the Honduran Air Force launches major counterstrikes on Salvadoran oil facilities, totally crippling their supply lines. This forced a sudden, grinding stalemate just a couple of days into the fighting, right as the Organization of American States, or OAS, scrambled to step in and negotiate a ceasefire. And the diplomatic panic that followed was honestly pure absurdity. The OAS literally had to beg. They asked, "Can you now please withdraw your troops from Honduras?" And El Salvador's response? Just no, please. No. They flat out refused to leave. They only finally relented when the OAS threatened them with severe economic sanctions. So the whole conflict lasted precisely 100 hours. That makes it one of the shortest wars in recorded history. But, that brevity is super deceiving, because in just those 100 hours, thousands of people died, and it inflicted massive economic devastation on both countries.
Okay, moving to Section 3, Case Study, the Falklands, a war over islands.
To really get this conflict, we've got to look at the incredibly dizzying colonial history of these cold, wet islands. They were settled by the French in 1764, then the English in 1765, then the Spanish kicked them out. Fast forward to 1829, and a merchant gets appointed governor by a newly independent Argentina. But eventually, the British just returned with more guns, and the islands officially became a British crown colony in 1840. It's basically a revolving door of empires.
And the absurdity of these territorial claims? It's really hard to overstate. Back when Spain originally demanded the islands from the English, their entire legal argument was literally just Pope, line on map, Spain's island. They were entirely relying on a centuries-old papal decree that basically drew a line down the middle of the world.
So, fast forward to 1981. We start seeing an identical pattern to our first case study. Just like that Honduran military leader, the Argentine dictator, Leopoldo Galtieri, was facing a huge domestic crisis. His economy was tanking, and his brutal regime was bleeding public support. So Galtieri decides that launching a highly popular war to reclaim Las Malvinas, the Falklands, would be his perfect distraction.
Now, Galtieri's invasion strategy seemed pretty straightforward on paper. First, capture the largely uninhabited South Georgia island. Next, send 600 Argentine troops over to the Falklands to overwhelm the tiny British garrison there and force the Royal Marines to surrender. But this entire plan hinged on one massive assumption. See, because the UK had recently proposed cutting military spending and had actually withdrawn an ice patrol vessel from the area, Galtieri assumed they just wouldn't bother fighting back.
Well, he assumed wrong. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher immediately declared an exclusion zone and organized a massive military response. We're talking a task force of over 100 ships dispatched across an 8,000-mile logistical nightmare. They literally had to requisition civilian cruise ships and container vessels just to make this incredible journey down to the South Atlantic even possible.
The clash of military assets here was a massive contrast. On one side, the British relied on their elite Royal Marines and Sea Harrier jets operating out of a forward base way out on Ascension Island. Argentina, on the other hand, had had weeks to dig in and entrench their conscript troops. And sure, they lacked naval superiority, but they utilized a totally devastating air force armed with Exocet missiles, and they had the political backing of almost all of South America.
The resulting two-month war, it was incredibly fierce. It kicked off with some major controversies. A British submarine sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano outside the exclusion zone, causing a huge loss of life. Argentina then retaliated by sinking the HMS Sheffield with a missile. After that, the British fought through just relentless air raids to form a beachhead at San Carlos. From there, these elite British forces had to navigate extremely rough, muddy terrain on foot, fighting off much larger numbers of Argentine conscripts. The whole thing culminated in a grueling 14-hour battle and victory at Goose Green, which was followed by a final, overwhelming assault that finally forced an Argentine surrender at Stanley.
All right, that brings us to Section 4, the price of conflict, zero winners.
Looking back at the football war, this whole distraction tactic achieved absolutely nothing. Both nations suffered immense economic damage. El Salvador couldn't even handle the sudden influx of all those returning immigrants, which created a severe crisis that actually helped fuel a totally devastating civil war later on. Heck, even in soccer, El Salvador went to the World Cup and lost every single match. There were literally zero winners here.
And as for the Falklands, well, Galtieri's regime collapsed in total disgrace. And sure, Argentina still maintains its claim today, but a 2013 referendum revealed that 99.8% of the islanders voted to remain British. So the distraction tactic completely failed to alter the territory's status. All it left behind were lost lives and fields of active landmines.
Ultimately, these case studies leave us with a pretty vital question to ponder. As long as we have political leaders facing plunging popularity and domestic ruin, is the next distraction war being planned right now? It's a pretty sobering thought for sure, but it's absolutely essential to keep in mind when you're watching global events unfold. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and remember to always question the real motives behind those headlines.